If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, as well as follow me and subscribe to me on all my other social media platforms. What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with another album review for you guys. This time, I am talking about an album that some people may not know about, but you're about to learn about it right now, and that is the new offering from Danish death metal band Maceration with It Never Ends. So this is Maceration's second album and their first one in 30 years. Their first album, which came out back in 1992, which was called Serenade of Agony. And the interesting backstory behind Maceration is, while they are a Danish band, they're most famous for having a vocalist, a legendary vocalist, on these two albums, and that is none other than Dan Swano from Edge of Sanity, Bloodbath, Witherscape, Nightingale. I could go on and on with the amount of projects that Dan Swano's been a part in vocally. And I learned about this band Maceration through Dan Swano's Into the Darkness podcast interview from 2 years ago, and lo and behold, I checked out some stuff from the debut, and it's really good old school death metal. Here, it's 30 years later, we get the band's second album, different lineup, no Jacob Hansen. Instead, Swano's just there on vocals, as a session vocalist, where they got an actual other vocalist who's now doing everything else for Maceration going forward. But how does It Never Ends stack up? Well, if I were to pretty much put it as in simplest of terms, this is some fantastic old school death metal right here. Like, there is so much old school laced all over this album. Like, the majority of these songs, we kick things off with Lost in Depravity, which starts off with this, atmospheric and murky piano with ambience on top. And then it gets into this, evil melody with the guitars, and then just right into, classic Swedish death metal riffage, from Entombed, and maybe a little bit of early Edge of Sanity, Dismember, bands along those lines. You get a lot of those old school Swedish death riffs going on here, and it also helps that the guitar production itself is fantastic, as it's the HM2 tone, which I love HM2 sounding guitars, and that's what you get laced throughout this entire album. And these riffs, like here in the opening track, it gets into that thrashy energy, but then you get into some bolt thrower grooves, and that's kind of a theme on this album. It's balancing different tempos, whether it would go from maybe a doom section into some grooves, or from a groove into thrash, or a thrash into blackened sections, which I'll talk more about in a bit. But then it goes into a track like Epiphany of the Past, which gets into a little bit of doom with the opening riff and the opening section, and it definitely kind of screamed Asphyx or even Hooded Menace a little bit. And then it gets into a hardcore groove once again before it gets into a blackened section with the tremolos and the blasts. But then tracks like Arcane Secrets and A Sacrifice of Pity, those two tracks in particular are two of the shorter tracks, but they're packed to the core with thrash energy all throughout. But they have certain differences, like Arcane Secrets brings in more of the tremolo riffs once again, while A Sacrifice of Pity has more dissonant riffing going on, as well as an atmospheric bridge that kind of gives off a horror movie vibe. But then you get into songs like It Never Ends. The opening track has an opening melody and groove that reminds me of the song Back from the Dead by Cancer, and it stays in that groove for a moment before it gets back into a thrash forward speed with evil tremolos, more cool grooves. But then some of the grooves and the dissonant riffing on this track in particular kind of reminds me a little bit of Immolation to some extent. Engulfed in Agony, the following track, straight up classic death metal, but with some more blackened blast beats here and there, more dissonant riffs. On the Edge of Nothing, kind of obituary-ish when it comes down to, like, the grooves and the D-beat stomps that you get on here. Like, for the most part, a lot of the grooves on here feel very bolt thrower influenced. Here on the Edge of Nothing, it's more obituary influenced. Like, that opening riff, groove, and D-beat kind of reminds me of the song, I want to say it was the song End It Now off of the last Obituary album. It kind of mirrored that, at least to my ears. Tender Twigs of Innocence once again starts off on that more doom metal note and even a doom groove, bringing back that Asphyx feel before the tempo picks up into like Morbid Angel territory a little bit. And then it suddenly gets a little bit punky towards the end, and then it gets thrashy. And then we end with Monolith of the Cursed, which has this cool opening riff and drum flurry before it turns doomy for a moment, and then groovy and dissonant, but with tremolo riffs added it on top. So like I said, like overall these songs just kind of diversify the tempos and the riffage a little bit. And this album pretty much balances everything wonderfully well with atmosphere, aggression, dissonance, the old school death metal vibes, some doom in here, a lot of thrash, some hardcore grooves, and blackened tremolos and blast beats. Though there is a different blast beat, like in the opening track Lost in Depravity, you get a more straightforward death metal blast beat before those like evil tremolo melodies kind of come through. The leads on this album, definitely very Morbid Angel inspired. Like, it kind of goes everywhere from, like, the squealy dive bombs like Trey or even Kerry King do, but there's also some atmosphere and even some melody. Like, the final track, Monolith of the Cursed, that lead had more of, like, a classic metal vibe to it, which was pretty cool. And then, like, going back to, like, the atmospheric leads, particularly on the tracks Engulfed in Agony and On the Edge of Nothing, you get those more atmospheric leads as opposed to, like, squealy dive bombs. Excuse me. But yeah, a lot of these tremolo riffs that you get on this album definitely remind me of classic Swedish death metal and even early black metal, so it's like, kind of goes everywhere from Mayhem to Dismember to Bathory to Entombed a lot of times throughout. And these riffs, like the riffs in general, feel like old school death metal done quite well. Dan Swano's growl, like his growling vocals are still really strong, and he puts on a killer performance on this album. Though also he brings in a big scream on Tender Twigs of Innocence, where suddenly, out of nowhere, this big giant scream comes out of his mouth, which was, whoa. And then finally, the production on this album. Of course, it's Dan Swano production, but it sounds incredible. Like, he balances everything out. It's not super compressed. It sounds amazing and fantastic. Like, all the instruments, well mixed. Then again, the bass could have been up just a tad bit more, but then again, it's hard to do that whenever the bass, again, follows along with the guitars. But regardless, top to bottom, I absolutely loved this album. This is a contender for, like, top 20 at this point for Album of the Year. I'm giving this a 9.5 out of 10. This weekend was strong for albums. High Command yesterday, and now Maceration today, both getting near perfect scores. I'd say you guys should check this album out and buy it if you can. This is some awesome old school death metal that has like that Swedish death metal charm with the guitars and in a lot of the riffage. So if you are a fan of Entombed, Dismember, Edge of Sanity, or even like Bolt Thrower, Asphyx, and Obituary, you will definitely, and Morbid Angel, you will definitely love this album. Definitely check it out if you haven't already. But that does it for my review of Maceration's It Never Ends. What did you guys think of this album? Let me know in the comments below. And until next time, horns high. See you guys later.
I've noticed that once people hit Slayer, they're like, is there something more extreme than Slayer?
Yeah, it's the crossroad, you know. Either you're going like, okay, this is too much, or you're like, I need more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I found Cannibal Corpse on YouTube when I was 12 or 13, and the hammer smashed face bass solo.
Of course.
Of course, already then I was a bass player. But when I heard that, I was like, okay, that's what I'm gonna do. This is it. And then it just spiraled downwards from there.
And it just keeps growing and growing and growing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it never stops. It devours you.
Yeah, because